Hello, my name's Tim Erickson, St. Paul Tim on the internet. We're here for our every other week online user group meeting. Today, Jen Lambton is going to be talking about how she manages alt text in a sort of creative way to get alt text used attached to the file and not to the node. We'll get into that later. For now, let's introduce ourselves. I guess I've already introduced myself. I'm here in Deerwood, Minnesota. A beautiful day. Let's go around the room. Let's do Martin, then Justin.
Hello, I'm Martin Price, Yorkshire Pudding Around Backdrop, and I'm a backdrop web developer and contributor from Northeast England, United Kingdom.
Hey, Justin, and then Irina.
Justin Kaiser, normally in Muncie, Indiana, but today I'm still in Atlanta at the end of DrupalCon.
Hey, Irina, and then Nate.
Irina Zaks, a web developer working from Bay Area, building sites.
Hey, and Nate, and Jen.
Hey folks, I'm Nate Lampton, quick sketch on the internet and technical lead for the Backdrop project.
Hey, Jen, if you want to introduce yourself, but then let's do a backdrop live promo before we go into your session.
Okay, sure. Jen Lampton joining from Oakland, California. Very excited to share my favorite way of handling alternative text on images and backdrop today. But before we get into that, take it away, Tim.
Sure. So let's talk quickly. A week from today is our next version of Backdrop Live. Looking forward to seeing everybody there. It's if you're looking for information, it's events.backdropcms.org. There should be links on our other sites to that. We have a schedule that's filling up. We've got sessions on DDev, documentation, recipes, Backdrop CMS for education. There's going to be a follow-up session to the discussion we're having today, where we'll talk a little bit more about it. We're looking for folks to demo their favorite contrib modules and themes in this session, and you'll see a lot of empty sessions as well. I won't go through the whole schedule, but anyway, it's a lot of fun stuff and a lot of open blocks for people to fill in. This is an unconference, so anybody can suggest a topic and get it on the schedule. And we really encourage you to do so. I think that's it. I'll just we'll leave that at that. I'll before Jen starts, we'll introduce this as there's with this quick sort of background there. Backdrop by default has an alt text field on images, but it's tied to the node. And so when you add alt text to an image, it only affects the image instance on that node. And so if you create another node with the same image, you have to re-enter the alt text. We have an issue in core about trying to tie the alt text to the image instead. And as we were sort of talking about and debating strategies for that, Jen talked about how she uses file entities and fields on file entities to achieve the same thing with things that are already there for us, but just maybe not obvious to everyone. So we asked her today to sort of demo how she does that. And we can talk about, if there's extra time, we can talk about this general problem and like if and how we solve that in core, or we could save that for Backdrop Live. So go ahead, Jen.
All right, so I'm dropping this link into the Zoom chat. If somebody wants to share it in Zulip, that would be great, but it is already on the events Backdrop Live event description if anyone needs to reference it later. But I just threw together a blog post that includes all of the code samples that I'm going to show today. So if anybody wants to copy paste those for another project, they should be easy reference. There's not a lot of words in the blog post yet, but I'll go back and clean that up a little later. I just wanted to get those out there. Yeah, so let's see, maybe I'll do a screen share. And just for fun, I decided to do this on my local copy of backdropcms.org. So I have created a news post that we're going to be looking at the alternative text on drop here. And for reference, the drop image has a field on it called alternative text. I think by default in Drupal 7, file entity provided 2 fields on an image entity. It included alternative text and title text. This example just has alternative text, but you could probably do something similar for title if you needed that. So this is the file entity. So under file types, image, the field name here is just field alt. I think in file entity it was field image alt or something like that. So it's a little different if you're porting from an existing infrastructure that you updated from Drupal 7, you might have to rework the field names and stuff in the code samples, but that's how this is set up. In terms of displays, I don't have this field, the terminal text alternative text set to display anywhere because it's going to be inside the rendered image. I do think it could be useful to have it display with the, I don't know, preview or something. So if you edit the blog post, having something that showed what, I don't know, could be interesting. Anyway, starting from the beginning, the way fields are rendered by default, let me actually remove the description text from here. We'll pretend like it doesn't exist. Okay, so the way backdrop renders by default is if you have alternative text on the fields, this is the image field on the node. This is actually saved in the same table as the value of the referenced image. So in the database, there's the field data table has all of this information together, the file ID of the file you're referencing, and the alternative text is all stored in that one table. And all of that information is associated with the node. None of it is associated with the file directly. It just references the file through that field. So the way images are intended to be described by alternative text is the text should describe what you're seeing in the image. And so when you reuse an image, it is very likely that your alternative text is going to be the same every time you reuse that image. And when you have this field associated with the instance of the image being attached to an individual piece of content, it's very likely that those descriptions are going to change. If you reuse the file across multiple places, you might not remember them all, or it's just hard to manage. If you want to make a change to one, you then have to go back and change all of them. And so having the ability to save the alternative text with the image makes it a lot easier to manage. If you have a lot of images where you need to, I don't know, give one editor, please go through and add alternative text for all of my images, it can do that. And it would be nice if all of the instances where you've used those images already would be updated with the new text that they've added. So if you work with the default behavior, what I'm going to do is just add the location of where this text comes from so we can see the difference. If you add alternative text onto an image and save it, then we should see, so I wasn't sure everyone is going to be able to see in my inspector for what the alternative text is. So I also have a debug message to on the screen. So here we should see the alternative text coming through from the node and that the field on the node, and that's what's going to render in the image. If you want the field from the image to, or from the file to render in the image, you've got to do a little bit of work to do that. It's not nearly as much work as it was in Drupal 7 because a lot of what you need is already there. And so what I recommend doing is adding a pre-process function in your theme. So here is, this is running the Borg theme. This is just for example. This is not real yet. And I have a preprocess field for preprocess function on a fields. So the first thing I do is check and make sure that it is an image field, a field of type image. In my examples on my blog, there's also a recommendation to do it for an individual field because you could have a lot of different image fields. And if one of them something like background image, you probably aren't going to want alternative text associated with it. But this is just a blanket, all image fields handle text this way. And then if we just look at what's in here to start with, so if we look at the element that's provided, let's just look at all the variables. This is just stock, what comes out of Backdrop Core. What we're gonna get is, oh, well, I'll fix that in a minute. The element is the form element that we're currently working on. So this is the image field. And it includes a lot of stuff that's really useful. Items is each individual image that that field is referencing. So in this case, it's a one value field. So there's one value in here. And in this collection of information about the image, we not only have the alt text, which is what comes from the image field data, we also have this field alt in here. So I didn't do any work to put this here. This is just comes from Backdrop Core. So this is the field that is on my file and it's already accessible in the image field data itself. So that I think was a piece that was a little bit harder to do in Drupal. I don't know if we did this, especially when file entity went into core, but I noticed that it was here and I started leveraging it on my own sites because I don't know, it's much easier than I was expecting to be able to get the data out. So if we do go back to our image and manage the file directly and add alternative text in here, here's the file value and hit save. You'll notice that in this list of variables, items 0, is that where it was? No, element items, oops, items 0. You'll see that, oh, field alt does not have any values. Try again. So we did render it and it is cached at render time. So that's the render cache we're seeing there. So now field alt has a value inside. And so everything I need is already accessible to me in this pre-process function for this one field. So what I want to do is take the like safe value and use that instead of the alt value that is provided by the image handler. And so in my module, I can just say, we're going to create this alt tag and it's going to be variables of element of items. Just going to check again. 0 field alt. Field alt, language none, 0 safe value. We'll see if that's right. Nope. Oh. Okay. So now it is pulling the data from the file. And if we assign that value to the alt where it was before in that same set of variables, then we should also see it in the source code of the image. So if you can see my inspector, it says file headshot of Drop the Dragon. So that's all you need to do in order to use the image field of image file entity type image field value on your node entity image field to get it to render. So ta-da, done. There are a bunch of other things that you might want to do in order to make that work a little bit better. The one thing that I find most useful for people is I would want editors to know what that value is, right? So if you have one value in here that they might have entered previously, I would want them to know if that's not the value that's going to be shown on the display of the image. It would be really confusing if they're looking at the edit form and it says one thing and look at the view form, it says something else. And so there's a couple of different ways we can handle this. This example shows setting the default value of this field if there is a value for file. But depending on how you have your site architected, you might want a slightly different outcome. So one scenario is if you're upgrading from Drupal and you already had, or if you're not upgrading from Drupal and you already had a whole bunch of alternative text stored in these fields, the ones you can see right now on the node form, then you don't have anything in your new architecture on your file entity where, like, if you want this data to be used, you're going to need to not override it with the empty value coming from file entity. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can say, oh, I only want to override it if it's not empty, or you can migrate your data. This is what I think should be done in core for the future, is to migrate all of the data out of this field and put it into the fields on the file entity if there isn't already one there. And then that way this would be empty unless, or we could, show the value that comes from file entity. And then we're also providing an interface here where somebody can override it. So like if I see this and I go, oh, this is an interesting description coming from the file entity module, but I wanted to make it more descriptive. I don't know. If I save this form now, this value is not updating the file entity, it is updating the featured image. And so this is now an override of that value that's on the file entity. And so that I think could be really useful, because there might be some places where, depending on like the blog post you're putting the image in, you want to give some additional context that matches the context of the blog post. And I might want to have a few instances where this value is different than it was on the image itself. And so I like the idea of still providing the interface here and allowing it to be an override of what's on the image that appears everywhere it's reused. The problem with the way I have it set up right now is that if I just leave it as it is, which I've altered in this value, if I hit save, it's going to then copy what might have been exactly the same value into the fields table. And so there's a couple of different recommendations I have for how to handle that. And this requires a little bit more leveraging of your site. So copying this value in, just so you can see what that looks like. Form alter. So it's not a lot of code to get the value to appear in the edit form, but that's because all I'm doing is putting it in as the default value. The default value will get saved if there's nothing in there that changes. So if you want to stop this from saving, if it's exactly the same, you have to add some additional logic into here. So when you save this form, it compares the two values, doesn't save it if they're identical. And what I think might be better for a core solution long-term is if, rather than this being the default value, if we added it as placeholder text, so people could tell when they look at it, this is obviously an example of what's going to be there, but it doesn't save when you save the form by default, and you don't have to add extra processing in order to not save it where it would normally save. But if you're coming from Drupal's previous or Backdrop's previous architecture where you already have those values in this text field, you definitely don't want to be overriding the existing values with new values that might not be, they might be empty or that might not be as valuable. And so you can leverage the code in the rendering of your image however you need it. So you could say, use the value that's already on the node unless there's one on the image, or you could say use the value that's on the image unless there's one on the node. You can play with it in your preprocessed functioning depending on how any given site is set up. So I have a couple of sites that originally had all of this stuff the way Drupal 7 did it back in the day, and they were set up like this. And then at some point we added file entity module, and now there's a whole bunch of data over there. And I don't really know which data is the more important on any given image or any given instance of an image. And so I have it set up to show the file entity description in the field, and then in the description field, I overridden that with, if there's an image, it'll add the image description in there. So whoever the editor is can choose what they think is more important. There's another outstanding issue for core 2. Like right now we're looking at the image field. But if we look at the add field, I'll fix those later. This also gives us a field that is not associated with the file entity. It's only associated with the field. And so if you're adding an image from an interface that's not specifically a file entity add form, you're not going to get the access to the field that's on the file entity. And so trying to figure out how to handle that in core is a little bit more tricky. If you're running an existing backdrop site today, I recommend using the inline entity form module. It'll allow you to display your image entity form instead of your field for your node form. And you can make it so that every time you add an image, the add form is adding it for the first time in the right place. In core, we could choose to make it so that it leverages this same field, but if the image is being created for the first time, it could save that value with the image instead of with the content. But I do think that that's a little risky because it could be that the first time you're adding this image, you are putting it in with a context that needs slightly different alternate text. And so it would almost be nice to have like the upload process say, this is the alternative text that describes the image. You click upload, and then when it loads this form, it gives you a second opportunity to put in the alternative text to override it in this context if you needed to. So we need to sort of figure out what the ideal workflow would be to handle these two different storage locations of the same value and make it make more sense for editors. But yeah, so that's what I was thinking. Anyone have any thoughts before I move on?
So, am I right in thinking the current implementation, you have to do it in both a module and the theme? You can't do it, won't work just in a module, it has to be both.
You can do it in a module because you can do field preprocessors in a module too.
Yeah, so I wondered.
Yeah, I think the reason that I instinctively went to do it in a theme is just because that's where all of the other preprocesses were that I was working with. After I finished writing up all of my sample code, I was like, oh yeah, that could go, this whole thing could go into a module, and I could make a like contrib module that's like use file entity fields instead or what have you, and you could include the field in the module. It was the kind of thing I hadn't thought all the way through when I first started working on this. I do think you could do it there. It is dependent on the architecture of your site. So I think you would, if it's going to be in a contrib module, it would have to include those fields with the module, or it would have to say, make sure your fields have this name, or it might have to provide an interface that's like reference the field you're going to use for the alternative text. Like there's just got to be something that can tie those together. But I do think that it could be done in a module. Yeah. The other thing too is that if you wanted to specify this by image field rather than all fields of type image. So if you wanted to do like this is field called image, I might have another field called background image where I don't want it. You'd have to provide some way in the module to choose between those two, all image fields, some image fields, and if it's only some image fields, which image fields. So again, like it's got to know a lot about the architecture of your site in order to get it right. But yeah, I do think it could be done in all in a module. And it's not very much code, right? Like there's like, what is this? 11 lines in the form alter and 10 lines in the preprocess function. So like 20 lines of code. There's definitely room in that module for a very hefty administrative interface, but the amount of administrative interface you'd have to write compared to the amount of custom stuff I throw in my theme, I just never thought about making it into a contrib module until today when I was putting together what I was going to demonstrate, and I was like, oh, this could definitely be a module. So yeah. Any other thoughts?
I like the idea of showing it as a placeholder text. So I think that sounds like it might be the best approach on that.
I think that's definitely my favorite approach for the edit form. I don't really know about the add form. Like if you go to add a new file, you get the file entity form that includes the alt field. and any other fields you've added to your entity. But this is not the same field that you get when you're adding an image on a new piece of content. But they have the same name, which can be a little confusing to people. So trying to figure out how to handle this situation, I think, is going to be harder. Yeah, I know in modern Drupal, adding a file is a lot more complicated just because they have another level of abstraction between the file entity, the media entity, and the content. But they do have sort of a modal-based workflow that might be useful to review for Backdrop, where we could maybe see if, like, the file entity creation had lots of steps. The image upload does not. In some ways, that's really good because it makes like creating content really fast. You're like reducing the clutter or the noise that you have to do to just create a post. But we have this extra step now where we have that other alternative text field and we don't have anywhere to put it in the current form. So if this was more of a multi-step process for uploading image, where one, it was like upload your image, and two, it was like, here's your image entity form, and then you hit save, and then it reloaded this form with the image entity, and the alternative text was now the placeholder. That might be like, I know it's a more complicated interface than what we have now, but it might be a clean enough solution that it would work to solve the problem and not slow down that editor experience too much.
You may have talked about this because I was chatting with some other folks in the middle of this. But does this always only work with image fields and not inline images in the body?
This right now only works with image fields because I put the handling on the field itself. Like I put the data into the field and the regular field renderer renders the alternative text where the data is. If you're going to put it inline, I guess my question would be like, how are you doing that? Like using CK editors button?
Yes. Yeah.
So if
There.
we did a select from library, for example,
Right.
where's the other drop? There we go. This now is, I think, rendering using filter module. So let's just look at what that output looks like. So this is, maybe I should do it on the existing one, just for funsies. Okay. So this, there's no alt text on there at all. So right now, this alt text, I think, comes directly from this interface. Where is it? How do I get it to open?
It's either the alt button down there or edit.
Yeah. So I guess what we'd want is this would have the default value in it from the file entity. And that would have to do that when the image was inserted. So that could even be before the file entity exists,
Right.
because yeah, you just uploaded it. If you browse from existing, I think we could do it a little more easily. Yeah, that's tricky. I feel like we could definitely do it with a definitely.
That's where the modal kind of comes in Drupal, because you're adding the image first and then adding everything, then it saves, and then you're putting it where it goes.
Yeah, I think what our system does is it saves the file as like a temporary file until you save the node, and then it copies it to permanent. So I don't know if we have an equivalent. I mean, I think we do, right? Because all these files are marked as they're marked as temporary before, yeah. So I think you still have, yeah, we could do the same thing because we have all the metadata about the file even before it's permanent. and then it gets deleted later if it ends up not being kept around. So I think we could do that. I don't know enough about how to get information into CK Editor, but the fact that we're already doing it with the image makes me think that there's a pretty clear pathway for that. I would assume you could do the same thing with the alt text. It probably goes in as like a data attribute, and the editor reads it out of the data attribute and puts it into the UI. And then when you save it, it goes out of the UI and back into the data attribute. And then when it renders the data attribute as alternative text instead. So we would definitely need some built-in core support for that in order to make that pull the value from the file entity field and then provide that as a default that's overridable. And then obviously what would be overridden is what goes into the data attribute in your body field. It wouldn't overwrite what's in the file entity table. But yeah, I think that's reasonable. I hadn't thought about that. Thank you for bringing that up. I hadn't thought about how that would work in the editor.
And then I would run into a whole nother can of worms when I used paragraphs.
Well, paragraphs, if you're using image fields, it would be the same because
Well, I would use body fields inside the paragraph sometimes. And then people would
it
add
should be
text and images.
yeah, I think it should still be the same. I
Okay.
think like depending on your fields, the processing would be the same. So the image field, I think we've got no problem. The body field we can handle with the filter system. But you're right. Like for different field types, this now we're handling this like one field at a time. There's also like a reference field. You might want to like render the whole entity. And then in that case, like how would you override it, right? Because you're only ever rendering the value directly from the entity. But there are other ways you can render images that aren't, that maybe we're not thinking about. In core, I can only think of 3. There might be others. Oh, user profile images. Would probably also need handling because that's not a field. But yeah, I think there are, we'd have to sort of work through all of the ways you can render an image in core and then figure out how to get the alternative text from the entity into the rendered output for each instance. But I think as long as your paragraphs are using more of the things that we've already covered, like another image field or another, full text field where the filter system can handle, or another reference field once we figure that out. It should be the same. It doesn't really matter what base entity it's connected to, whether it's a node or a paragraph or a bean
It just
or
seems like
anything else.
every time I make something, I'm like, oh crap, doesn't work with paragraphs. So I had to think about it.
Yeah. Hey, Nate, I don't know how much of that you heard, but we were just theorizing how much work it would be to add default alternative text value into the image handling in CK editor. Do you have any experience with that?
Jen, I'm
I
gonna
mean-
interrupt and just say your voice has been like just audible, and then once in a while when you talk quieter. So I don't know if you can speak up or turn up your volume just a little bit, it would help.
What if I put the microphone closer to my face?
That's better.
Better? Sorry.
Yeah, for CK Editor, off the top of my head, I can't think exactly how that would work, but I'm sure that it's doable. Um, uh, yeah, especially for reuse, like when you click the image button and then you select an existing file. I bet that the reuse would be really easy to integrate if we had some mechanism of saying like this thing is the alternative text,
Yeah.
Um,
My
yeah,
guess is that it's a data attribute.
it's just literally the alt attribute is what it is, like in the source code, right? It's not data.
It's not rendered differently in CK editor than it is in the real world.
No, just whatever you see when you click the source button is what CK Editor is using in its interface and everything.
So maybe we could pass it in as a data attribute and then tell CK editor source to read it when like how do we get this image in here before it exists? Like
So click off of it and hit the image button. So
Working
don't,
off of it is easier said than done. There we go.
there you go. So, and then I'm not quite sure why it still
Still on the
selected
same
it,
one.
but yeah, can you use, yeah, there you go. Now click the image button.
Okay, there we
Now
go.
select from library,
Yeah,
right? And just when you click on one, like I guess actually because it's populating. So right now the alt text, the source is being populated here. We would need to amend the listing here to also pull in the alt text by default. Yeah, because alt
yeah.
text is a field there.
But if it already has it here, this is much easier because I don't think we need to do anything with Seek Editor. We can just alter this form.
Hmm. Yeah, the
Yeah,
image browser. Yeah,
yeah.
to
Okay,
also include the alt text.
yeah. And that I think is pretty straightforward. What about adding a new one? So what I remember is that this creates a temporary file and inserts the temporary file and then only saves the temporary file as permanent when it's saved, when the node is
Um,
saved.
Yeah, but the file
Is
entity
it
and everything like that, it already all exists. As soon as you uploaded it, it already made all of the things there, the file
so
entity and
we would
the
just need to change that form, the upload form, to include an input field for alternative text.
I mean, it's already there, right? In the
No, I
when
mean for the
It,
entity, right? Because the entity exists
for
right
the
now, but we
for
haven't
the
added.
file entity, not the
Yeah,
node.
not the CK editor.
yeah. Yep.
So we're trying to figure out how to like connect all of the pieces in two places. Um, yeah, and I was looking at the files table and you can see they all have entities even when or they all have the fields in the data when they're temporary. We just don't have a way to get that in, I don't think, in the editor upload interface. But is this the same, delete, is this the same upload field? It is here.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. It's already there.
So this
But
is the same form as the library form.
yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's just hiding and showing different fields
Yeah, the
there.
library. Okay. Yeah, I think that's not going to be that hard.
Yeah, and this is a normal backdrop form. It's alterable and everything. But this alternative text is it's not tied to the file entity in any way. This is just
This
like
is.
inside of this instance inside of Seek Editor because it
Yep.
also has stuff like alignment and
Yep.
caption and image size and all of that
Yeah.
stuff is not tied to the file entity.
Well, that's the same as like this isn't tied to the file entity either.
Yeah, that it's
So
that
we're trying
instance
to
of
figure
that
out
file.
like how many ways do we render in images in Backdrop Core where we would need to add this extra attachment to the file entity. And so far, I think we've come up with 4. There's the file fields, or sorry, the image field, maybe file fields too. I hadn't thought of that. The image field, the body filtering system, which I think is where CK Editor does it. User photos, which I don't even know what they do for alternative text right now. They might just default to some string like so-and-so's user photo, and reference fields.
You mean like when you're
And
referencing an image or
yeah, because you
yeah,
can
in which case
render
you're showing a
entity.
display mode of that file, right?
Yeah, so the rendered entity on its own without going through anything else. Um, which I guess is just the same thing as like the rendering the file entity, not through a field, but can you think of any other ways that we might handle images in Core? I guess like our hero image, that goes through regular file fields, doesn't it? Doesn't it not? Um,
Hey, I believe that's yeah.
we changed it recently to a regular managed file field, didn't we?
Yeah, and gave
In
it
this
the
case,
browser. Yep.
it's a background image though, right? So we wouldn't want alternative text here anyway.
I guess not. Yeah, because of the way it's rendered, it's not actually an image tag.
Yeah. What about like a site logo?
Well, this is the worst form in backdrop. I think it's funny how many times we come across the site settings page and how this page is built out. Yeah, this is not using a managed
Managed
file
files.
field. And I don't think that it creates a file entity either. It just throws the file into the files directory and then references the path.
Yeah. So then I guess the question is like, do you want alternative text on your logo?
Hero
that might-
images.
What
Hero
was that?
blocks. Hero blocks.
Yeah, we just looked at those. We decided
okay.
because they're background images, that we don't want alternative text there anyway. If it was like a, yeah, I don't know, that could be tricky. Like if there was a carousel or something, you might want to have an ARIA live region updating, and it depends on, I think, your use. If it's always a background image where it's just decorative, then maybe you wouldn't want it. But if there's like content in those images that's important for the context of the site, you might want it. Yeah, I don't know. But for a logo, I think there is a alt text on a logo. Might not be the best example. But it just says something logo.
Yeah, I think it maybe the default behavior is like site name logo or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we have a couple of options. Like we could switch that form to using file managed if we wanted to. We could also provide another field here for alternative text for logo. But
Yeah, this is a whole separate problem, though. It doesn't need to be the same as, the content.
yeah, that's true.
Yeah, the issue that we have for tracking this is 4007. And I just posted some comments on it today, cross-linking this video.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
look
I
at that.
guess
Filed by you.
yeah, it makes sense. So another question I guess would be, even if we can't figure out how to like make that ideal user experience for fresh installs, the question would be, what are we going to do with all of these people that already have data in the image field? Like there's a couple of different options for how you could update those to a site that has fields on the file entity. Like one of them, you could be like, we're going to add the fields, but we're not going to move any data. Another one could be, we're going to move all of the data, and then you'll have to like decide again when you're editing content if it needs to be overridden or not. Might not matter if people aren't going to be reusing those images on their site. Maybe how they were done before is fine, and we only let them choose for new images being added. But if they are reusing old images, it might be useful to have description text from other places. If an image is reused with different description text, how do we handle that scenario? So yeah, I think the upgrade path is a little tricky.
Yeah. Well, there's some other user interface issues that are at stake here too. That we don't know what the name of this field is. The field alt
Well,
text.
if we added it, we would get to choose the name. There would be a problem for sites who are already done this before we added to core, or sites that have upgraded from file entity in 777.
Right. And
Yeah.
so that whole mechanism doesn't exist right now of like mapping some fields to alt text into title text, and then the behaviors that would have could be pretty far reaching, like alt and title text. Well, first of all, they'd need to be a certain data type. They'd need to be a text field. But then like would those fields disappear from like the managed display form, because you wouldn't want alt text to show as a field, I don't think.
You might as a preview. Like if you're on an admin form and you're like looking at a preview of what this image might look like, you might want to be able to read the alt text without viewing the source of that image.
Yeah, I guess so. If you were at the like if you were looking at yeah, file/file number, you know, the file entity page,
The
not,
rendered entity on the page. I was also thinking like there, I don't know how often this is, but you know, on the image form, we're going to have this field next to it so you can read it. But there could be some instance where you're seeing this like preview image and you don't have the form available. Like maybe in the image browser.
yeah, well, I mean, yeah, that's the other thing, is that we don't show the entity form in any of these other scenarios. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. There's lots of things to think about there.
Yeah. I feel like we definitely could detect a site that had 0 additional fields on the file entities. And that would be a safe one to update. And then we could do something like, if you've added any field at all, we're hands off. There could be some documentation or contrib module that might help you move stuff around in the way that you might find more helpful. And then only when, you know, our fields are there, do we do anything special with them. There could be a setting somewhere, a hidden setting or like a config setting that someone could use to hook up their own alternative text if they wanted to, but I don't know. Upgrade paths are hard. Any other thoughts? We have about 10 minutes left. Bulk editing. So like you get like a table of images with like all of the fields on the left for how to add alternative text to them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you would be able to set up a views bulk operations with it and have a list and be able to edit them, like a bunch of them on one
all at
page
once.
at a
Yeah,
time. And that would also open up the AI bulk editing too, because I
yeah.
could connect it to that sort of thing and have hit the button and send them all off, and
I
it would
think
fill
there's
up
a
the alt
contrib
fields.
module for that in Drupal 7. I don't know if we have it for Backdrop yet. Was it just called bulk edit? Where it was basically like a views field you could add where you select a field from your entity that you're viewing and it'll put all the fields in there. Editable, use bulk
Vicky had a
edit.
question about how to do that in her site, and I'm like, well, you can't do it yet. Because she wanted
Yeah.
to use views bulk edit or views bulk operations, and you
Mhm.
can't get to that. You can't get to the alt text field in views.
So views bulk edit module doesn't have a 7 release. There was a module I saw this in before though. I don't
Okay.
remember what it's called. Bulk update fields, maybe? But yeah, I'm not sure that's a core problem. I think it's a bigger problem than image alt text too. I think it should apply to lots of things. So if we can make it a views module, that would be great. This also does not have a Drupal 7 version.
Well, I got called away for a little bit, but I noticed that Irina had brought up captions for images in the chat. I don't know if you guys addressed that at all. Does captions
Nope.
behave at all the way alt text does? Jen, could you do something like that, like your solution with captions?
Yeah, so if you had a field on your image file entity for captions, you could do something similar where in your field pre-process, you could render it as like a figure with a fig caption and print the caption in the fig caption field. And then you would probably want to add a field to the image image field widget that would put it on there too. And so you could at least visualize what that caption is going to be before it prints on the page. But if it was an edit form, that would be even better. The question is, where does it save when you save the edit form? Does it save back to the original image, or does it save into the instance? So it's a little bit more complicated because there isn't already built-in caption support in field handling. There is already built-in caption support in CCAditor. And so that I think would be a little bit easier if you were referencing all of your fields in your body. You could pass it the caption the same way you'd pass it for having entered it on the edit form.
Good. Okay, well, thank you. Is that it for this discussion? Okay.
Yep, I think so.
Again, and I'll probably watch this again later because I missed some important parts of it. I'm interested. One, I have a client that wants this feature that we could probably just use your method for, Jen, but then I'm also interested in the core issue. So, and I was here for most of, I think, the early part. So I think I saw what we need to do for this client. So
yeah.
Thank you. Let's go ahead. I mean, it's 5 minutes to the hour anyway, so let's go ahead and wrap up this session. Again, a week from now, we have Backdrop Live, so there won't be any meetings next week. The week after that, we do have another user group meeting, and I don't think we have a topic yet. So please let me know if you have things you'd like to see us do in the user group. Oftentimes coming out of Backdrop Live, we have lots of ideas for things we either want to repeat or follow up on. So hopefully we'll have some new ideas. Do you want to go ahead and end the